So we had this very simple crypto system where I had one S box, and before the S box I do an XOR with K0, and after this box we have the XOR with K1. And before that, the differential style cryptanalysis was able to recover the keys K0 and K1 in less than 2 power e. Basically, the main idea is that the difference in the plain text input in here, we were able to bypass it to this point without any knowledge of K0, and we were guessing K1, and when we guess K1, we know V0 and V1, and we can invert the S box operation, so we know U0 and U1. So if the guess of K1 would allow us to have a consistent guess for U0 XOR with U1, we would know that our guess for K1 is the correct guess. So now let us just try to extend this attack when we add one more round in the cycle. So we're still playing with the toy cycle. So in here we have added one more round. So again, from the beginning I can always use the same trick. If I know the difference in the plain text, I can pass it to this point. So if I know delta P, which is V0 XOR the V1, then without any knowledge of K0, I can tell delta U, which is U0 XOR U1. Now I'm going to guess the value of K2. So when I get the value of K2, I will know the value of X. And since the S box is public, I can do the inverse operation in here. So I know the value of delta W. But now, at this point, I know delta W. I don't need to know K1, so I will be able to know delta V. But now I have an S box where I have delta U and delta V. In this case, there is no way for me to deterministically make sure that my guess is right. Because there are so many, if I observe the delta V in here, there are many different delta U's that will go to delta V. So again, just think of the S box. If I know the state, if I know the input to the S box, I can deterministically determine the output. But if I know the difference going to the S box, there are so many possible differences coming out of the S box. So in this case, I cannot have a deterministic relation, but I can only work with probabilistic relations between the input and the output. So again, let's stick to the same numbers we have in the first example, where the difference in delta U here was F. And let's look at, if the difference here is F, what are the possibilities for the output in this point? So we're just going to sort of exhaustively list all the possibilities if this is U0. So this is if the difference between U0 and U1 was F. Then I'm just going to exhaustively list all the possible differences in delta V. And if you do this, this is just a very simple substitution operation through the S box. And you list all the possible differences in delta V, you will find that some of the differences appear more frequent than the others. So in this particular case, for this particular example, the difference D appears 10 times out of 16 times. So when we're doing the analysis, what we're going to do, we're going to assume that this difference is going to happen. So this is an assumption I'm going to use, and I'm going to be right by probability 10 over 16. Say 10 over 16 times, my guess is going to be correct. So again, what we're going to do here is that I'm going to guess K2. When I guess K2, I will be able to know X's. And when I know X's, I am going to assume that I can actually do the inverse S box operation. Then I'm going to know W's. And I'm going to assume W should be the value D. Sometimes I'm going to be right, sometimes I'm going to be wrong. But on average, I should be right about 10 over 16 times. So what we're going to do is that if you repeat this operation and every time you end up with the Like when you get the value of k to your guess would evaluate delta w equal to d, you increment a counter associated with k. And now if you repeat this operation with other pairs of plain text, for the keys that, for the really correct key, the counters associated with this correct key are going to be incremented 10 over 16 times on average. Like we are going to be incremented with probability 10 over 16. But when your key guess is wrong, the probability that the key is going to give you the right estimate is only 1 over 16. So what's going to happen is that if you repeat this operation several times, so I have here 16 key, because I have 2 to the power 4 choices of k1, I would have 2 to the power 4 counters associated with them. And every time my key gives me the right guess for the value of delta w here I'm expecting, I increment this counter. If I repeat this enough number of times, the right key guesses will be incremented by probability 10 over 16, and the wrong key guesses will be incremented by probability 1 over 16. Which means that at the end of this, after I do this enough number of times, the right key guesses will have counters that have much higher values compared to the counters associated with the wrong key guesses. So again, if you didn't really get what I'm explaining, the main idea is that when we only have one round, everything works fine in a deterministic way. When I have more rounds, there is no way for me to propagate the knowledge in a deterministic way. So what we do is that I propagate the differences through the S boxes, but differences cannot propagate through the S boxes in a deterministic way. They can only propagate in a probabilistic way. So I just pick, in this simple example, I just pick the difference that travels with the highest probability. And I assume that this is the difference I should observe at this point. So if you try to generalize this concept, or before I generalize this concept, so the main idea is that in any SPN network, or like you remember we have two basic structures, the substitution permutation network structure and the Feisel structure. So I only have two layers. I have substitution layer and I have a linear transformation layer. The linear transformation layer, if I have some input difference coming in, I will be able to determine the output difference in a deterministic way. But for the substitution layer, I cannot do this. I can only do it in a probabilistic way. So we construct something that we call difference distribution table for the S boxes. So for example, for this particular S box we have, I'm just going to pick one example. Here it says if my input difference was 2, so which means that I have x1 and x2 and the difference between them is 2, then I can have an output difference equal to 1, 6 out of the 16 times, or equal to 2, 6 out of the 16 times, or equal to 9, 2 out of the 16 times, equal to A, 2 out of the 16 times, and so on. So I can actually, this is what we call the XOR distribution table of the S boxes. And if I look in here, I find that there are some values that have much, like for example in here, if I have an input difference F, this value stands because it occurs with much higher probability that I should expect to have an output difference equal to D. And this is the value I used in the previous example. So in the previous example, I somehow constructed this XOR distribution table, and I assume that while I'm executing the attack, when I have an input difference equal to F, I should observe an output difference equal to D. And while I'm making this assumption, I know that I'm going to be right 10 out of the 16 times. So again, as I told you, like all the attacks we were explaining on block ciphers would start by building a distinction. So in our case, when you're doing the differential cryptanalysis, you are actually going to see differences that have higher probability of propagating through the first R-1 rounds. So if I have some, for example, I build the XOR distribution table of all the S boxes, and then I find that there is some difference delta A, delta B pairs that have high probability to occur, then I say that I'm going to assume that they are always going to occur. And I know that I'm going to be right with probability B1, which is the probability of having difference delta A going to difference delta B. And then I'm going to concatenate this difference with the difference in the second round. So in the second round, I have to start with the same difference I ended up with from the first round. So now I start with difference delta B, and I look at what is the highest difference, or what is the value of delta C that has a maximum probability, and so on. So I build a transition probability between delta A going to delta B, and then delta B going to delta C, and then delta C going to delta D. And if I know that the probability of going from here to here is B1, and then the probability of going from here to here is B2, the probability of going from here to here is B3, then I am going to assume that the probability of going from here, starting from a difference delta A and ending with a difference delta D, is going to hold with probability P1 times P2 times P3. Okay, so let me, the example I shown was some sort of it's a toy example on an S-box. No one builds an encryption system with one S-box. I'm going to show you how this attack works on reduced round versions of the data encryption standard. So in here I'm going to show you what we call like a characteristic, a differential characteristic for 3 rounds of DES. So in this case, remember that the differential cryptanalysis is a chosen plain text attack. The attacker has the right to choose the plain text he's using. So suppose I started my plain text by L0 and R0, and then I have another plain text which is L0 dash, but in here I don't change the plain text. So I have 2 sides. One side I keep it the same in the pairs of plain text, and the other side I'm going to have difference in it. So if I see the difference in here, do I have any difference in here? So there is 0 difference on this side, and in here I have a non-zero difference. So in here I have a difference delta L0, but in here delta R0 is equal to 0. So when I have 0 difference going into a substitution function, I should expect to have, if you don't change the input, you don't expect the output to change. So if you have 0 difference coming in, you should have a 0 difference coming out. So the difference at this point should be delta L0. So delta L0 travels to here, to here, to here. So in here I have delta L0, which is controlled by the cryptanalyst. Now, since we're attacking a reduced round version, the cryptanalyst also observes the value in here. He has access. For us now, this is the whole cycle. So the cryptanalyst have access to these 2 points in here. So the cryptanalyst can observe the difference in delta L3, which is the same as the input to F2. So I know the difference to this point. Now I also know the difference in here. I know the difference in here, so I can determine this difference. Because I know that this value is just the XOR of these 2. This value I got it from here because I control it. This value I got it from here because I observe it. So basically now, this is the example we started with. This is the very first example where I have some sort of a substitution function, and I observe the input difference coming in and the output difference coming out, and then I can determine the key for this function. So basically this is a differential attack on 3-round reduced version of DES. So the main idea again is that you control your input, or you choose your input difference in a clever way so that you are able to propagate the difference as many rounds as possible. And you also make use of the fact that you observe the output difference so that you can pick a substitution block where you are able to determine the input difference and the output difference. And if you know the input difference and the output difference of a substitution block, you will be able to determine the keys that control this. Of course, 3-round version is some sort of a very small example, and this is again, it works almost in a deterministic way. But if you extend it to a larger number of rounds, we need to use some probabilistic approximation for the differential probability. So in here, this is an example for the 6th round DES. So if you try to attack 6 round DS, you cannot have a differential characteristic that propagates in a deterministic way. You have to use some probabilities. So I'm not going to go into the details, but the whole idea is that it's almost an art on how you pick up your characteristic and how to propagate it. There is no systematic way of doing it. So you cannot even right now, even though like this has been done very long time ago, there is no algorithmic way that you can, like there is no way that you can write an algorithm that allows you to calculate the characteristic in an efficient way. So until now you need to use some, you need to depend on your experience in determining this characteristic. So let me just briefly remind you with what I have done so far. I have shown you the 2 basic architectures for building block ciphers, the SPM and the faster structure, and I've shown you some very basic examples for how to attack them using differential cryptanalysis. What I have done so far, there is pretty much no research in this. But the research that is left in these parts is that, remember when I told you that when I calculate differential characteristic, I sort of cheated when I say, if I have a characteristic and then I know that for 1 round, the probability of going from delta A to delta B is P1, and then the probability of going from delta B to delta C is P2, probability of going from delta C to delta D is P3, and then I said the probability of going from delta A to delta D would be given by the multiplication of these 3 probabilities. This is where I cheated, and this is what we have been doing for a very long time. The main problem with this is that if I tell you like this probability, you should tell me how did I calculate it. Did I calculate it over all possible plain text, ciphertext pairs? Did I calculate it over all keys as well? So usually when we do this, in most of the time, we assume that this probability is not a function of the key. But in reality, it is actually a function of the key. So this is where we are cheating. And the research community have been using this approximation that this probability is not a function of the key. We're assuming that all the keys are independent. And there are like very large number of papers produced with this assumption, until people started to show some counter examples for ciphers where this assumption does not hold. It's as if you're saying that I am calculating some probabilities that is averaged over all keys, but the problem is that when you are attacking a cipher, you are attacking a cipher that is instantiated with a specific key. So suppose I have like very large population in my probabilities in my sample space. What you are able to calculate is the average over all keys. But what you are trying to attack is only specific instant instantiated with a given key. So if you are interested in some research directions actually in this topic, this is still some sort of unsolved problem, that if you're trying to design a cipher, how do you make sure that there are some design strategies that allows you to limit this probability, which makes sure that you are on average you are doing okay. But the problem is in cryptography, you don't want to make sure that you are on average doing okay, because there might be some classes of weak keys, for example, for which this probability is too high. Okay, let me show you other examples of differential cryptanalysis that are sort of also easy to explain. So in differential cryptanalysis, I have explained so far what we were trying to do. We were trying to find high probability differential, which means that I have some input difference. I observe some input difference here, and my objective was to find input difference, output difference pairs that go to like that, such that I can go from the input difference to the output difference with high probability. It turns out that you can also have an attack if you can find some input difference that never goes to this specific output difference. So this is what we call impossible differential attack. So what we're trying to do when we're building the impossible differential attack, we're trying to find some input difference here, such that if I observe the input difference here, I should never observe the output difference in here. So let's look at the DES structure in here. Suppose I observe the difference 0 and delta in here. And I observe the difference 0 and delta at the output of these 5 rounds. Can this happen? So if I have a zero difference here, so I should have a zero difference here. I should have this delta. I should have the delta in here after this point. Right? And I should have the delta is coming to this point. Same thing in here. If I observe delta in here and I have a zero difference in here, I can propagate my differences, which would imply that I also have a difference delta at this point. So now, by observing this output difference and this output difference, I concluded that the differences at these 2 points is delta and delta, which implies that this point must be the XOR of these two, which must be 0, which means that I have a 0 output difference coming from this function, but I can also prove that this function has a non-zero input difference. So if you have a function and you know that this function has a non-zero input difference, you know that it must have a non-zero output difference. So we just reached the contradiction, which means that this differential is impossible to observe. So how can I, again, what I'm saying is that in the normal differential cryptanalysis, you try to find delta input that goes to delta output with high probability. But also you can utilize the fact that if you observe delta input that should never travel to a specific delta output, you can use it to launch a differential cryptanalysis attack. And in this case, we call it impossible differential attack. So the example I'm showing, you have a difference 0 and delta, and assuming that you observe it 0 and delta here, you know that something is wrong. This can never happen. And we proved it by just propagating the differences through this simple structure until I reached these 2 points where I proved that this f function has 0 output difference, but I know that it has a non-zero input difference, which means that I reached the contradiction. So how can I use this? So again, I should never, no matter what you put as 0 and delta here, if this is ds, you should never observe this output. So how can I use this to launch an attack? So here I built an impossible differential for 5 rounds. I'm going to show you how to use it to build, to realize an attack on 6 rounds ds. I don't think I have the slides, but it's trivial to show. So suppose I have one more round in here. So what we're going to do, I'm going to get the last round key, the key for the last round. And if the key for the last round showed me that I have this difference, then I must know that my key guess is wrong. So again, suppose I have one more round at the end. So I'm going to put a difference 0 delta in here. Then I'm going to guess the key for the very last round. Now, in the normal differential cryptanalysis, I was actually including all the keys, but the right key would be included with a higher probability. In this case, I'm actually going to exclude the wrong keys, because I know that if my key guess shows me that I have this difference, then this key guess must be wrong, which means that I have to exclude this key guess. So if I have one more round at the end in here, I'm going to get the key for this last round, and based on my guess, if my guess showed me that I should have this difference, I know that my guess is wrong, and I would exclude this value from my guess. And if I repeat this enough number of times, I'm going to exclude all the wrong guesses, and I should end up with the right key guess. How many of you is still awake?
Yeah.
How many is following? Okay. So there's the second most famous attack is linear cryptanalysis. So if you like to work in this area, there is a very nice tutorial by someone called Howard Pease. And the name of the tutorial is Tutorial on Differential and Linear Cryptanalysis. So all my students, everyone who comes and I decide that he is going to work on this area, I give him this tutorial and I ask him to implement it. It's a very nicely written, and he himself wrote it actually for his students. Instead of spending like he was telling me, instead of spending same time over and over with them to try to explain to them the basic introduction, he decided to write it down in a very nice way so that any student who comes to his group and decided to work on this topic, you should read this tutorial first. So again, the name of the tutorial, you can just Google Howard Heys, Heys, and Howard, Howard, and you can Google linear and differential cryptanalysis. So it's a very nicely written tutorial, and if you decided to work this area, it's almost a must that you implement the example attacks that are described in this video. So now I'm going to explain the basic principles of linear cryptanalysis. So I'm going to again to start with the same toy cipher we have in here. So this is the same cipher that we attacked with linear with differential cryptanalysis. Now I'm going to try to attack it with linear cryptanalysis. So if you try to form a system of equations for this cipher, what you're going to have, you're going to say that U is equal to V XORed with K0, and then you pass, you say V is S of U, and then C is equal to V XORed with K1. So suppose I am able to, the only problem is that this system of equations is a nonlinear system of Boolean equations. So we know that this is a, if I give you a nonlinear system of Boolean equations, even if it's quadratic, it's very difficult to solve. Then suppose somehow magically I am able to, and the only reason for this system of equation to be nonlinear is that the substitution layer is nonlinear. So suppose I replace this by a linear system, then I should be able to very easily solve a system of linear equations in K0 and K1 and recover the keys. The only problem is that S is non-linear, and it doesn't make any sense to say that I'm going to replace it with a linear system. So what we're going to do, we're going to replace S with a linear approximation. And we know that this linear approximation doesn't hold in a deterministic way, but it will hold with in a probabilistic way. So if I give you the substitution box, so in our case, our substitution box, you have 4 bits coming in and 4 bits coming out. So what we try to do is to find some linear approximation between some non-zero linear combination of the output coordinates and the input to the S box. So again, what we try to do, we try to find some linear relation that holds between non-zero linear combination between the output coordinates, non-zero linear combination of the input coordinates. And we try to search for alpha and beta that maximizes the probability of this relation to hold, or minimizes it. So this is the main difference between linear and differential cryptanalysis. Because I know that this probability, if this is, in the worst case, it should hold with probability 0.5. If you have a binary relation that holds with probability 0.5, you gain no information about it. But if this relation holds with very high probability, you gain information. If it holds with very low probability, you still gain information. So what we try to do, we try to find alpha and beta that either maximizes the number of times this relation holds, or minimizes the number of times for which this relation holds. So in this case, if you do just the simple computation, you would find that in our case, if I picked alpha equal to this, and if I picked beta equal to this, then I would have this relation, which would hold with this probability. Again, this is just a computational exercise. The only way to convince yourself that what I have in this slide is correct is to just do the computation. Basically, you calculate this value for all the values of alphas and this value for all the values of beta, and you do all the combination and you count how many times this relation holds. So it's again, this is an exhaustive search almost, sort of computation. So now I found out that for this particular S box, this relation holds with this probability, which is relatively very high probability, because if the S box is purely random, I should expect this relation to hold with probability 8 over 16. But for this particular S box, this relation holds with probability 14 over 16. So how can I make use of this one? So this relation I found that it said there is some linear combination of the output coordinates here and linear combinations of the output coordinates here that are equal to each other. So basically this relation, if I expanded it, it would mean that the first bit in the, you can just read this line, the first bit in the plain text XORed with the third bit in the plain text XORed with the second bit of the ciphertext should equal to these key bits, irrespective of the value of the key bits. So this parity relation should always hold. And it should always hold with the probability that I calculate. So what you're going to do for this attack is that you're going to actually, the way that the linear cryptanalysis works is slightly different than differential cryptanalysis. So after you build this approximation, you know that this relation holds, and it should hold for all the plain text, ciphertext pairs. So all you have to do is that you just generate as many plain text, ciphertext pairs, and from these plain text, ciphertext pairs, you evaluate this side. Suppose I generated hundreds of them, and I found out that this side was 90 times out of the 100. Then I would know that the key bits that are on this side, I am going to decide that their parity is 1. So basically, it's as if this linear relation would allow me to recover one bit of information about the key bits. So how would I recover the other key bits? I have to build another sort of another linear relation, and I have to repeat the attack. The only trick is that when you don't have really to repeat the attack the way I described it, because I can construct as many linear relations offline, and then I can just test them in one time during the online phase of the attack. So let me repeat what I said. So the main idea is that if you look into this encryption algorithm, everything is linear because the XOR operation is a linear operation. The only nonlinear component is the substitution box I have in here. So my way is that I try to build a linear approximation for this S box, but I cannot build a linear approximation between all the input bits and all the output bits. It's very unlikely that you're going to find any useful linear approximation that will hold between all the bits here and all the bits here. So what we do, we look for a linear approximation that will hold between a non-zero linear combination of some of the coordinates in here and a non-zero linear combination of some of the coordinates in here. And then we use this to build a relation between the plain text bits, the key bits, and the ciphertext bits. And then I generate some plain text ciphertext pairs, and I calculate the parity of the side of the equation that involves the plain text ciphertext pairs. And if I repeat this enough number of times, I can conclude the parity of the key bits on the other side of the equation. So it's as if after repeating this attack, I can tell whether K00, K03, K12 is equal to 0 or 1, for example. And if I build enough linear relations, I can form enough number of equations in the key bits that I can solve to uniquely determine the keys. I'm just trying to give you a flavor of many attacks as possible. So now I'm going to move to a different type of attack. This is the, I'm not sure if you follow the, or you know what, how many of you know the advanced encryption standard? So the data encryption standard was the US standard until the late 90s, and then they realized that it was sort of getting too old. The key length was too short, and it was too short to the extent that some people were suggesting some hardware devices that would break it, for example, in 3 hours and a half, and the device would cost $1 million. And no one cared about them because they did not build the device. And these were like, even these designs were good designs in the early 90s, but again, it's not, like no one would take you serious if you say, give me $1 million, I'll break it for you in 3 hours. So in the academic community, people knew that the key length is too short, but again, no one was listening to them until the internet becomes very widely used, and the Electronic Frontier Foundations decided to have a DS key search engine that you can use in a distributed way throughout the internet, and they actually managed to break it for free. Right? So this hardware device that was supposed to cost $1 million to build, you replaced it with zero cost distributed search for the key. So now, at that time, like people realized that it's really serious because you can break it for literally for free by distributing the key search among different users on the internet. So at that time, they decided to replace it with another standard, what we call the advanced encryption standard. So the advanced encryption standard, the way they designed it is that they had an open competition, and it was organized by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and there were several submissions from different research groups and from different industries, different countries. Eventually, they decided that the most suitable candidate for to become the advanced encryption standard is Render. It's a cipher that was called Render. After it was adapted, it's a family of ciphers, which means that it allows different block lengths, different key lengths, different number of rounds. But when it was adapted to become the advanced encryption standard, only specific choices of these parameters was allowed. So like, not every render would fit as an AES, but every AES would fit as render. So the way the AES rounds works is that every round has 4 basic operations. So the first operation is substitution operation, which is basically a lookup operation through S boxes. And then you have what we call shift row operation, and then next column operation, and then add round key. So this is an SPN network, so you should expect to see substitution layer and a linear transformation layer. So in here, this is the substitution layer, and these 2 operations together is just a clever way of implementing the linear transformation layer in an efficient way. So because basically, suppose my block length is 128 bits. So you don't want to do the linear transformation over the 128 bits at the same time because it's going to be inefficient. So the way they do it is that they do it on 1/4 of the stage at a time, and they somehow mix these 2 operations together so that you achieve good diffusion. I'm going to show you how it's done. So the first stage is the substitution operation. It's basically you take every, let me pick, I think this is not that good. Okay. So suppose this is my render now, so the way that you present the state is that you represent it such that you have a matrix. The matrix should have 4 rows in it. And then depending on your block length, you decide how many columns I'm going to have. For the advanced encryption standard, now let's say that for my explanation, I'm going to assume that I'm operating with AES 128, which means that I have a matrix. My matrix should be 4 by 4. Because 4 times 4 is 16. 16 times 8 is 128. And now the first stage is the substitution or the byte sub operation. So basically, you take every byte, you pass it through the S box to get the output of the byte sub operation. And then you have the shift row. So basically the shift row operation is that you take the first row, you shift it by 0. So we're doing circular shift. And then you take the second row, you shift it by 1. So basically it's as if you're shifting every byte here by 1. And then you take the second row, you shift it by 2. Third row, you shift it by 3. So the byte shift operation, again, it's a circular shift operation. So this is just another illustration of how it works. The first row, you have no shift. The second row, you shift it by 1. It's a cyclic shift. So the byte that was here would go to the other side. And then we have the mixed column operation. So the mixed column operation, you take each column and you multiply it by a matrix. This is the matrix I was mentioning that it was optimally designed so that it optimizes the diffusion properties. So this matrix it's very carefully designed such that if you have one change, if you have a change in 1 byte in here, you're guaranteed to have a change in 4 bytes in here. So it's an MDS matrix, which means that if I have 1 byte change in the input, the 4 bytes would have to change in the output. So if you have any little difference in the input coming to the input to the matrix, all the output of the matrix will change. And actually the design is not only, again, this is a very nice combination between engineering optimization and mathematical optimization, because the design of MDS matrices is relatively very well known. But in here, if you see the coefficients are pegged in a very special way. If you see the coefficients, they are very low weight coefficients. And I only have zeros, I only have 1, 2, 3. So if you are implementing this, we're not doing multiplication actually when you do like that. Again, like you need to do multiplication, of course. But if you're building the hardware circuit to do the multiplication, you're only multiplying by 1, which is no multiplication, or multiplying by 2, which can be done in a very efficient way, or multiplying by 3. And if you think of how to multiply by 3, it's actually just adding multiplication by 2 to the value itself. So you only need to build a multiplier for multiplying by 2. Because if you have a general MDS matrix with a general set of coefficients, you would have to implement it with a very expensive hardware. But the matrix here was chosen so that it's an MDS matrix. At the same time, it can be implemented in a very efficient way. And finally, the add key operation, which basically you take your state and you add the key bits to it. So again, all you have to remember is that the main 3 operations in the round function of AES is a byte sub operation, then shift row, and then mixed column. Okay? So now what I'm in the remaining maybe 10 minutes, I'm going to show you a very simple attack on AES. Again, on a reduced version of AES. So this attack is what we call the saturation attack. It goes with different names. Sometimes it's called the square attack, because the first time it was proposed again as a cipher called square. So let me show you the attack. So now we're going to use some symbols. When I use the symbol C, it means that this input is constant. It doesn't change. When I use S, it means that this input is going to vary over all its possible values. So if I have S here, it means that I'm going to vary this input from 0, because this is 1 byte, right? So it's going to vary from 0 up to FF. If I have a C in here, it means that this input does not vary at all. Like suppose you fix it to a random value, suppose you fix it to 15, you just keep it, fix it to 15 over all the set of plain text you have. When you see B, it means that if you sum all these bytes that in this position, it's going to be balanced, which means that it's going to give you a 0. So again, in my notation, I have either S, which means that the value of these bytes is going to take all the values between 0 up to 255. You see a C, it means that it's fixed to an arbitrary constant. If you see a B, it means that if you observe this byte and you just add all the values that appear, it should give you a 0. So now suppose I started my input with values like this, which means that all the bytes are fixed to some random constant, except for the first byte, I'm varying it over all its possible values. Now when I pass this through S boxes, if the input to the S box is fixed, what do you expect as the output of the S box? It's also going to be fixed, not the same value. Right? This C is not the same as this C, but I'm just denoting that this byte is constant. It doesn't change. So all these C's will go to all these C's. So now I have a bijective map. I am putting all the possible inputs from one side. Then I should, when I look at the other side, I should observe all the possible outputs. So if you have a bijective map, and in the input to the bijective map, you vary the input over all its possible values. If you look at the other side, you should expect to see all the possible output values. They would appear, but maybe they appear in a different order, but you don't care. All I care about is that all the possible values appear. So if I have my input like this, so this input is actually 255 input blocks. All these bytes are fixed to some random value, but this byte I start with a 0, and then I have 1, and then 2, and then 3, and up to 255. After it passes through the S box, these bytes should not change, but this value would take all the possible outputs. After I pass through the shift row, the first row I don't shift it. The second row I do the shift, but when you shift the constants, it gives you the same set of constants. So this relation will hold. Now when you pass it through the next column operation, you're multiplying a matrix by constants. So let's pick these 3 columns because these are the easiest thing. If you multiply a matrix by a constant vector, you get a constant vector. Multiply a matrix by a constant vector, you get a constant vector, same here. But the third one here, you can prove that if I have a vector and the first element of the vector takes all possible values, then if I look at the output of my multiplication, all the output bytes should take all the possible values. So basically, the thing about this is that this relation propagates independent of the key. So it's some sort of, I'm building a distinguisher that if I am putting this input to my AS round, I know that this relation should propagate to here irrespective of the choice of my key. And if you add the key here, again, irrespective of the choice of the key, if you add a key to a constant, you get a constant. If you add a key to some value that takes over, if I have some value that takes values between 0 up to 255, and I XOR it with something, I'm going to get, again, the same set. It's going to be the same set from 0 to 255, but maybe in a different order. So even after I do the add key operation, this structure would remain in here. And you can actually just continue over the second round. You can just continue propagating the relation in here until you can prove that if I have 3 rounds, at the end of the third round, remember here I have 255 inputs. They were constructed such that only one byte is varying over all its possible values and the remaining bytes were fixed. If I observe the outputs of the third round and I added all the values of the bytes, so if I observe the first byte and I added all these values together, XOR addition, I should get a 0. Same thing for the second byte. If you added all the bytes that you are observing, you should get a 0, and so on. So in here, what we're proving is that I am able to build a distinguisher for 3 rounds of AES, such that if the input satisfies this structure, the output should satisfy this structure. Which basically means that you observe any output byte and you keep adding the values you are seeing from this byte, eventually you should get a 0 if you're doing XOR addition. So how can you use this to attack 4-round AES? So this is AES, 4 rounds of AES. So this is the round function in here. So basically, again, you're using the same idea we use in all attacks against block ciphers. I start my attack by building a distinguisher. So this is a distinguisher we had from the previous slide. It says that if I started my plain text with this structure, after 3 rounds, I should have the ciphertext following this structure. So basically what you do is that you guess the key for the last round. If you guess the key for the last round, you are able to know the value of this byte. And then you verify that if your key guess is correct, then you know that these values, when you add them together, you should get a 0. If you don't get the 0, then you know that your key guess was wrong. So it's a very simple attack on 4 rounds AES that allows you to recover. You can just repeat the attack for this byte, and you test that this one is balanced and so on. So now this is an attack on 4 rounds. I'm going to show you how to extend it to 5 rounds. So again, I'm taking almost the same attack, but I'm just expanding it by one more round. So what I'm going to do is that I'm actually going to guess 4 bytes in the key. Like in the attack on the 4 rounds, I was guessing 1 byte at a time. But now I'm going to guess 4 bytes of the key, but I'm going to guess them so that when I propagate my knowledge backward, it would allow me to recover these bytes. So I'm going to guess them in this funny way so that when you do the inverse shift row operation, they are going to be aligned across one code. And then when you, assuming that I know the value of these 4 bytes, then I will be able to recover the value of this byte, which would allow me to know the value of this byte. And then I should test whether this byte is balanced or not. If my guess was correct, then this byte would be balanced. Again, the beauty of this structure attacks is that there is no heavy math, there's just common sense in them. But in order for you to understand them, there's no way that I'm not hoping that you're getting maybe 30% of the basic idea, but if you just get the very high level idea and then you go and verify it by hand, you will find that it's very simple. So you can extend the attack by even one more round by saying that this is what I want to have in here. This is the beginning of the previous attack. So, but what we're going to do is that we're going to pick the value of this such that this is S, this is S, this is S, and this is S, and the rest are constants. And you can verify that for AES, if I pick my structure such that this is S, 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 and the rest are constants, after one round I'm going to end up with this structure. So it's basically, this is an attack on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rounds A. So usually, AES is an example of what we call like word-based block ciphers. They are much, if you are new to this area, although these are the modern block ciphers, but they are much easier to, or far more intuitive to understand than the complicated Feistel structures because they operate at, again, the basic ideas are very simple and very intuitive to grasp. Okay, so now I'm almost done with the sample cryptanalytic attacks. I'm going to give you some very high level, in the coming 5 minutes, very, very high level possible research directions in this topic. So the attacks we described were called like black box attacks because you sort of don't have any access to the device. The other types of attacks, the implementation-dependent attacks that I described early on in my presentation will be classified as gray box attacks. So the timing analysis or differential power analysis or the acoustic analysis, this is what we call gray box attacks. So in black box attacks, this is my attack model. I have Alice and Bob, and you assume that the attacker have access to the communication channel. He can insert, like he can observe ciphertext. This is the ciphertext on the attack, or he can insert, he can modify the data, whatever. But he does not have access to the, like he only knows the structure of the encryption and decryption algorithm, but he doesn't have access to the devices that are implementing the encryption or decryption. In the gray box, I'm assuming that the attacker have access to the device. He have access to the side channel information he can obtain from either sound or electromagnetic radiations, or from power consumption, or from execution time. These are the implementation attacks. And always remember that in all these attack models, I always have Alice here and Bob here. And Alice and Bob are always assumed to be the good guys. There is another attack model which we call the white box attack. So now I don't have Alice and Bob in here, but I have Alice, and Alice is talking to Eve. So where do you think we have this type of attack? Or like, can you give me an example for scenarios where the person who is performing the decryption is Eve, is to be treated as Eve? So this is a very realistic model for digital right management. So in digital right management, you have access to the decryption device, but you're not supposed to have access to the key. You download, for example, an e-book, whatever software, you're not supposed to know the decryption key. You're only supposed to use the decryption software, but you should not have access to the decryption key, because if you know the decryption key, you can pass it to your friends. And then, for example, you download a movie and you're supposed to play the movie one time only. But if you have access to the key, then you can download the movie and play it tens of times. Or you can give the key to your friends and they can play the movie on their devices without paying for it. So the white box crypto model assumes that the attacker is in full control of the machine that's doing the decryption, which is again the exact case scenario for the digital right manager. So at the same time, imagine now the challenge: you would like to design your implementation such that even if the attacker can pull a debugger and or do a memory dump, for example, he has access to the whole memory, he has root access from the machine that is running the decryption, he should not be able to recover the key. So there are some papers on this, like you can find some, they go with the name white box implementations. So there are many implementations for white box, implementations for AES, white box implementations for DES. So far, there are no white box implementations for stream ciphers. Actually, the company that is doing very good job in this is it's in Netherlands, but they have the group that is doing this white box cryptography are in Canada, and it used to be called Clockware, but now it's called D2 because the D2 is they just bought them, and they are very interested to see white box implementations for some other ciphers other than AES or DES. Because right now we only know how to do white box implementations for block ciphers. We don't know how to do white box implementations for stream ciphers. We don't know if we can do white box implementations for public key systems as well or not. The other some sort of new topics in cryptanalysis, because cryptanalysis to some extent is becoming very difficult to find new results in it. But because there are some new modes of operations that are proposed, this gives more room for new cryptanalytic results. For example, we have what's known as Tweakble Ciphers. Imagine that you're doing hard disk encryption. So every sector on the hard disk should be encrypted, but it should not be encrypted with the same key. But if you change the key for every sector, it's going to be very inefficient. So one way to do it is that you use the same key, but you have one extra input to your block cipher, which we call a tweak. And this tweak, every time you change it, it allows you to, it's as if you have changed the key. But it's not really changing the key. It's as if you do some little modifications in the key without rerunning the whole key schedule. So there are some newly proposed ciphers that are meant to achieve this tweakable operation in a very efficient way. One of them was proposed at Asia Crypto 2014. It's called Kaizo BC. So basically, the tweak is these 8 bytes, and what they do, they just XOR the tweak, these 8 bytes, they XOR it with the sub-round key. So every time you change that tweak, you just perform this XOR operation. So it's a very efficient way of, it's as if you are changing the keys, like the active key, but you're doing it in a very effective way. So this is some stuff that some of my students were looking at very recently, because the cipher designer said, this tweakable cipher is exactly AES 128. The only difference is that we're using this tweak. And the tweak is not supposed to weaken the cipher by any means. So in the cipher, this is the main claim is that since we are AES 128, we are exactly AES 128 except for the tweak, then all the security claims of AES should hold for this new block cipher. But what we realize is that if you actually utilize the freedom you have in that tweak, you can extend the attacks on this cipher one more round compared to the attacks we have on AES. So again, the message I'm not going to explain the attack or anything, but the message I'm trying to convey is that with the new modes of operations, if you read the current cryptanalytic attacks, if you try to apply them to the existing ciphers, you're going to hit the wall, because there's not that much you can do. But if you look at the newly proposed mode of operations, you can find some room for getting new results in this area. I think I'm going to stop here. If you have any questions.
To create the system, when you talk about the stuff, when you have how many, you have frame, right? How many frame, for example, you want to break WEP, you need around 20,000 frames, and then you can make precisely get a key. So in your case, what you discussed here, how many samples you need to have the cycle tag so that you can have almost precise.
Okay, so in order to quantify the complexity of any attack, you have to talk about the data complexity, and you have to talk about the time complexity, right? And the data complexity, you can say that I have offline and online data complexity. So every attack will have different set of numbers. So I did not mention any specific attack, but all attacks have, like every attack will have a different set of numbers. But most modern block ciphers now, these numbers are completely gigantic. Like you talk about 2 to the power 1 in the order of 2 to the power 100, they are completely impractical. So most of the attacks are sort of theoretical attacks.
So when you have application using you have a PhD and someone has to using one. One from the key and one is the what about somebody is getting the E, right? Even he just use another, because you could protocol, right? This protocol. You receive some many input and then send to the receiver, and then someone try to decrypt back and do some information processing from another key, from another institution, protocol layer to duplicate someone can duplicate fine tune so that you can
what are you talking about the attacks on the protocol itself, right?
So but it still have encryption. Because the attacker tries to do something wrong, because they have communication from a team using 2 different keys. But the attacker knows another one key, because he has a key, and the second one is not.
Because the attacker knows one key?
Yeah. One of the, because you have 2 communication.
Okay. So in your attack model, I have a sender and receiver, and I have an attacker in the middle. That's your attack model.
In the middle, you know one of the keys, and another one.
One of the keys is either the sender or the receiver. But no, it's like most of the, again, like most of the modern block ciphers would come with resistance against this sort of attacks. So again, if you like to get one sentence for the state of security of modern block ciphers, they are practically secure. All the attacks you hear about or you in the media, they are just theoretical attacks. For example, the attacks on AES, like some media would say that the AES was broken or whatever. This is completely nonsense. The attack is academic attack or academic break, but it has nothing to do with the fact, like it's not coming by any means near to become a.
Because to me, this don't want to allow people to know that this system is created, right? Because if you install it as a secure, this means that this will know everything. The NSA will know. That's why they declare even in a secure, you say it's secure.
Okay.
They let people using unsecure things so that they can easily know what to do.
But for AES, I think the academic community believes that it's very unlikely that it has any trapdoors or anything. So again, they can't believe in the academic community that AES is secure.
AES 256.
Yeah. There's three versions. AES, the problem with the AES 256 is that the key schedule is not as strong as it should be, but still, all the attacks on AES are theoretical attacks. Like, they are by no means coming close to becoming practical.
If you combine all the attacks and everything, how much would you all
Currently, like, if you're talking about attacks on basic primitives,
even you have a supercomputer,
no, it doesn't matter.
you guys have a lot of supercomputer, and they have such kind of power attack, everything, they control power channel, they can track you.
No, such attacks are actually practical. The only thing is that if your attack scenario allows you to do it, they are practical. So you can break AES in this. If the model holds, you can break it. But I'm talking about these theoretical attacks, they are not.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Youssef. So that is the end of our workshop today. Now we will proceed to the closing ceremony for the workshop.